this evening's lesson, as I mentioned this morning, I'd like to begin a series of lessons over the next few months dealing with different evidences for creation versus evolution. And in this evening's lesson, I'd like to talk some about geology and some of the things to bear in mind when we look at creation and geology and the difference between what the Bible teaches and the theories of men, and what some of the evidence that points to recent creation and a biblical flood versus what we're taught so often in our schools and universities. We really have just one point of view that is allowed to be taught anywhere these days, and the Bible point of view and creation scientists that have the same degrees and same education that are looking at the evidence from a different point of view in the world around us, of course, draw a completely different conclusion about what the evidence tells us. So those things ought to be borne in mind. Catastrophism is certainly what the Bible teaches, that the world has only been here for around 6,000 years, and that it began by a miracle of God, that he brought everything into existence in 6 days and rested on the seventh day, and that the world that began there in the early days of mankind became so corrupted with sin that God sent a great flood upon the earth that's totally reshaped the surface of the earth. That world that then existed perished, and God started over with Noah and his family, and the earth that we live in now is quite different. The continents, the mountains, the rivers, everything is different than what it was before. And there's much evidence all around us of these great catastrophes that happened in connection with God's judgment of the world at the time of Noah. Over the centuries, in science, everybody accepted what the Bible had to say in the beginning. When all of the foundations were laid in the 1600s, 1500s, 1700s for all of our different scientific disciplines, you had all those wise scientists that came up with the basic laws in the different fields of science. They accepted the Bible as the Word of God. They were Bible-believing men. They believed in creation. They believed in the flood. They interpreted the evidence around the world based upon the Genesis flood. But over a period of time, there was a shift among those in higher education where they began to talk about the flood as just one of a whole number of catastrophes that happened. And at first, the flood was the key catastrophe. Then it got to be just one of the catastrophes. Then it only explain just a little bit of the deposits that we see around us. And then before long, it got dismissed altogether. It didn't happen overnight. It took several generations for that to happen. But those in the universities, the theoreticians, they basically did away with the flood. If it did anything, it was just this gentle thing, that happened, didn't affect anything. Can't see any evidence of it at all. So, great change. The doctrine of uniformitarianism by James Hutton was one of the leading doctrines that was being taught to try to do away with the flood, try to explain everything on the earth by present day processes that are happening in nature over slow, gradual time. The wind and water and so on have reshaped the surface of the earth over millions and millions and millions of years in order to see the things that we see around us rather than the great catastrophe of the flood and that great judgment. Charles Lyell took that forward. Darwin was influenced by them when he wrote his book about the origin of the species in 1859, and that great revolution happened in the universities, that Darwin had the answer for how life got here without having to have God involved whatsoever. And the age of the earth quickly went from 6,000 years old to 5 billion years old, or 4.5 billion years old, or whatever number that men attach to it. Peter told us that in latter times that there was going to be scoffers that would arise on the earth that would forget about willfully God's judgment of the world in the past at the flood. He says in 2 Peter 2 and verses 2 through 6, know this, first of all, that in the last times, this should be chapter 3, says, know this, first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mockings, following after their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God, the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. So they willfully ignore the great judgment of the world that happened at the time of Noah. And he said, these men will arise on the earth. Well, they've arisen. There's no doubt about that. And totally dismissed the flood and that God has ever intervened in this world and that he ever will. So the Bible is certainly shows great wisdom in predicting these very things. The initial creation of itself had a great effect on geologic history, of course. God made the world out of water. It was just a big mixture of water and earth, and it was all separated out. And at that time, there were many of these different stratas of water-laid material that was laid down in the crust of the earth even before the flood. You had that great work that was done. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the water. We're told in verse 9 through 13 during the creation that God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gatherings of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. So the earth was created with God's almighty power. He separated these things out and shaped the earth and did these things in a short period of time and created these plants full grown, ready to reproduce with the appearance of age to them. So you can see a lot of work was done back there by God that we might think would take millions of years, but God did it in one day with his power. So the dry land appeared. Rocks and other material of the earth was uplifted. You had great erosion when the waters ran off the land. Redepositing of materials taking place. The vegetation created with the appearance of age. You'd see a tree and think it's 300 years old, but it was just a few seconds old. And you have fertile soil with nutrition in it. And that's a difficult thing to have. There was a movie last year or so with Matt Damon in it where he's on Mars and he's trying to make some soil and all the trouble he had to go through to try to get that soil to where it would grow anything. Well, God made the soil right from the beginning with everything necessary in it to grow those plants. You would think that would have taken a long period of time for all of those nutritious elements to be put into that, but God did it in a moment of time. Then after the fall, the earth is cursed, and there's some other changes that take place to the earth and to the circumstances that Adam was living in. In Genesis 3:17, then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. So life became difficult. Weeds began to grow. All kinds of difficulties were involved in making a living that weren't there before. And as a result, the earth was reshaped again to some degree. In Genesis 5 and verse 29, when Noah was born, it says, now he called his name Noah, saying, this one shall give us peace. from our work and from the toil of our hands, arise from the ground which the Lord has cursed. So back at that time, the world had mountains. They evidently were not as tall as the mountains are now. There are rivers that are talked about in that pre-flood world. They had seas, probably not as deep as the seas that we have. Geologic activity was taking place in the seas. So there were all kinds of activity going on to shape the surface of the earth, but then everything is disrupted. The fountains of the great deep burst open. All kinds of volcanic lava and ash and no telling what all came out of the earth as the continents split apart and drifted apart from one another during the time of the flood. Continents were completely overwhelmed. Mountains are washed away, and then new mountains are forced up and arise, all during that over a year's period of time in which the flood was taking place. So you had worldwide geologic effects, the killing of all living things on every high mountain that we see around the world. We have sea creatures and all kinds of other fossilized animals that are evidence of these billions upon billions of animals that were destroyed in the flood. Great areas of vegetation all piled together and compressed to make oil and coal underneath this flood. So there's any true science, really, that we wanted to understand the past and how the world got the way it is, you'd have to take into account the greatest event that has happened in geology, and that would be the Great Flood that overwhelmed the world. And yet the scientists have dismissed that and replaced it with naturalism and this uniformitarianism and try to answer everything with millions and billions of years to try to account for what happened, where the Bible tells us about these great acts of God and great catastrophes that happened in the past. After the flood, what creation scientists have told us in reading different books about the Ice Age and so on, that really scientists don't have a very good explanation for what caused the Ice Age. They try to come up with some astrological reason that Earth moved out further in its orbit or the sun quit shining as bright. They had to come up with some kind of reason to get the northern and southern hemisphere frozen over. Where we have 10% coverage with ice, they had 30% coverage in the Ice Age of the Earth's surface. So something really radical happened to bring on that Ice Age. Well, it's thought, at least by creation scientists, that you had very warm ocean water after the flood. If you had volcanoes going off, the earth splitting apart, continents sliding apart, maybe several thousand miles if you look at the Atlantic Ocean and the divide that's happened there, that there was great heat that was produced. Instead of having a 39-degree average ocean temperature, maybe the ocean temperature was like 86 all over the ocean. And we all know that the hotter the water is, the faster it evaporates, and the greater the rainfall. Seth knows, living down in Florida, how much it can rain in just a little bit of time because there's so much heat out there in that water. What if it was like that in the Arctic? And in Antarctica, you had that hot water. Well, over a period of time, you'd have a lot of moisture that could begin to rain on the continents as they began to cool off. What might cause those continents to cool? Well, we have much evidence in science programs that are on all the time about how volcanoes go off, Mount St. Helens or Krakatoa, or these different volcanoes that have gone off in the last couple of hundred years. I think in 1815 they had a year without a summer because of a volcano that erupted over in the Orient somewhere. And as a result, they had freezes and frost in the middle of the summer that killed crops. What do you think was going on in the past after the flood? The earth didn't just calm down all at once after the flood. We have evidence of great lava flows out in Oregon and Washington, cover like a third of the state of Oregon, some of those volcanoes with lava. Well, those things were going off after the flood. And so there would have been a cooler temperature on the earth over the continents. So you have warm temperature up there in in the north because of the warm water, and you've got cooler temperatures on the continent, and great amounts of rainfall and storms. And as those northern latitudes began to get colder and colder, you'd have all of that moisture falling out of the sky and building up that great ice sheet that eventually was built up. Before that ice sheet came, there must have been a period of time, based on the evidence, when there was a lot of vegetation in the far north and south, and there were a lot of animals that lived in those areas that got buried under that ice when the ice age came on. So these things would have happened in a short period of time. If you've got a warm ocean and you're producing a lot of rainfall, we see some tremendous nor'easterners that come in and dump all kinds of snow in Boston or somewhere now. What if you had that going on all winter long? It was going on like every week. It was piling up snow like that. And then in the summertime, because of the volcanic ash and stuff in the upper atmosphere, it didn't get warm enough to melt it for a while. It wouldn't take long till you'd begin to pile this snow up. There are different estimates that have been shown that it might take 500 years to build up these big ice domes that are in Canada. Here's a dome that was located here, one over here close to where you have all of these northeastern storms along the Atlantic, and it's 2,000 feet high of snow and ice piled up, begin to move south, flow south. And again, you have this coming to an end as the earth settled down. You don't have as much volcanic ash. The earth starts warming back up. It doesn't take very long when the sun is working effectively to melt a lot of snow and a lot of ice. It's estimated it might have taken 200 years to melt that snow and ice. It'd be pretty catastrophic what would happen to all the rivers and all the lakes. Well, you'd have these big, gigantic rivers like the South Canadian River and that gigantic bank that's on either side of it, that we never see anything close like that now. But at some time in the past, a huge amount of water came flowing down that and made those banks of the river. And it's thought that the Ice Age, when it all melted, is what caused that to happen. All kinds of reshaping of the earth in connection with these things. Where in science, they have 6, 8, I don't know, I forget how many different ice ages that last, some of them 100,000 years and things like that, but really it could be explained with one great ice age that happened that would explain these things. Some of the evidence that we see left over from these things, of course, you have enclosed lake basins where this water ran off. Here are some giant, look at what the Great Salt Lake looked like as far as how far the water came up. Gigantic lake, 20,000 square mile lake after this ice melted. So it was quite a different country back at that time. And in the west, we have like Lake Tahoe. It's dropped 655 feet from where the evidence shows that lake used to be. Bonneville is just a salt flat, but it used to be a big giant lake after this ice age came to an end. Caspian Sea used to be 250 feet higher than it is now. This cold weather, when things changed, of course, we got much colder weather in the north and south because the water temperature of the ocean started going down to close to what it is now. And things began to freeze, and a lot of animals that were living high on the hog when they had the warm water, and you could live in the north, all of that came to an end. And so there was a great extinction that happened of these large animals that lived during the time of the Ice Age, and we find many of them frozen in the ice in Siberia, in northern Canada. And you can see some pictures there of these animals that they've dug up. And during the time of that Ice Age, you had very low sea levels. So much ice was locked up in those glaciers that were made. The ocean was 430 feet lower than it is now. You could walk on a land bridge right around the world. And you can see how men could spread out after the time of the flood, after the Tower of Babel, and be able to spread all over the world, the animals as well. What is the evidence they give you in school all the time about how old the Earth is? They give you this geologic column. Starts back here with the Precambrian and then the Cambrian. All of a sudden, there's an explosion of life. It's what they have in, all of the simple forms of life they stick down there, and they make it more complicated as it goes up. Isn't it nice if you got to lay out the bones and tell the story? Those bones are never found the way that they say, but they get to lay it out from the simplest to the most complex. And then they date the rocks based on what the fossils are that are in the rocks. And then they lay out this column. This column doesn't exist anywhere on Earth, but yet it's in every textbook, and they teach it like if we went out here and dug, we'd find all of those layers. They're not going to be there. Some of them will be there, but not all of them. Even the Grand Canyon just has a small part of that column that you can see with all of those layers that you see there. So we have written documents about what happened that go back 3,500 BC. Other than that, it's just speculation what happened. There was nobody there to see it. We have the record in the Word of God that comes from 1500 BC, right? Or 1500 BC from Moses, what had been handed down from the patriarchs and what inspiration guided him to write. But there wasn't anybody there. It's all made up, just so stories that people tell to try to explain the world around us. We have God's testimony, direct testimony from the Creator about when it started and what happened. And certainly that's what we ought to rely on. These two students, they're looking at these proofs of evolution, and you date the animals based upon what level they're in. You base the levels and decide what level they are based upon the fossils. You have this circular reasoning that goes around. Doesn't prove anything, but yet it's set forth as the answer. Every conceivable contradiction of this evolutionary column's been found on Earth. These columns have been found in every different order, stacked sideways, every different thing you can think of. And they always have some explanation for it. Well, it got flipped over. That's the reason the fossils are out of order. Some of them leak through from the top down to the bottom. Every time they find a contradiction, they reshuffle it some way or another where their story works out. So you have to realize who set up this whole thing to begin with when you go to school. And again, they have their basic fossils, and then they date the layers that they're found in. And there is some order found around the world in the way that these things are laid out in different places. But if you had a great flood, and it began to flood from down here at the bottom and started flooding up, I guess the bigger, faster animals would be able to go a little higher, get a little more out of the way, right, before they got buried. The sea animals and stuff, they'd get buried first. Couldn't it happen that way, just the same way, to explain the evidence? That it's the way that the order they got buried in happened all at once. Some recent findings that contradict this column that you can find online. Here's a Peruvian burial stone that's found down in Central America. It's got a Tyrannosaurus Rex eating a person there. How in the world did they come up with that? These ancient people. They must have seen something like that. Maybe this whole story about them being 65 million years old, maybe that's not right. And that's just one example. You can find, if you put in dinosaurs and men or dinosaur drawings or whatever, you can find the internet is full of those pictures that have been found around the world. There's down in Texas at Glen Rose, they had dug up the side of the bank there where some human footprints and dinosaur footprints going across each other. Here's a 5-toed llama that was supposed to be extinct 30 million years ago, but somebody drew it on this ancient pot that they found. Maybe that llama wasn't extinct all that time. Maybe it's been just a little while it went extinct. Here's a man's footprint, and it has a trilobite in the footprint. A trilobite is one of those that goes back 230 million years according to the evolutionary story, but here it is in the footprint of a human being that's only supposed to have been around, less than a million years or a million years. They have radioactive dating that they use to tell us about how old things are. They take some element and they see it break down into another element. Carbon-14 and uranium, lead, uranium deteriorating down to lead, or potassium going to argon. And they look at these rocks and they figure out how much uranium's in it and how much lead is in it or how much carbon-14 is in it, and they try to tell us how old that rock is. But there's a lot of assumptions you have to make that you're starting in the right place. How much of that original material was in the rock? And was it all the original material? There wasn't any of the daughter material there? Because if there was already some daughter material in there, it's not going to be as old as you think, right? And we don't know that. That's just based upon assumption. The rate of radioactive decay, is it always remain constant? There is a lot of evidence that's pointing to the fact maybe it hasn't always been constant. And that would throw all of the rocks off and all of your dates off if that weren't so. So none of their assumptions are true, so you're going to get erroneous results. Job kept asking, it was asked by God, were you there? Yeah, that's what Job's going to explain, how God does everything, right? And God's justice and rule of the universe. And God's answer is, what do you know, Job? Were you there when I did this? Were you there when I did that? And Job has to say, no, I don't know anything about it. And that's the boat we're all in. God was there. We weren't there. That's always a good question to ask a teacher. Were you there? Did you see it? Or is this just a theory that you've come up with to try to explain things based on your assumptions? Carbon-14, a certain amount of carbon-14 is in the air and in the plants, and the animals eat it, and then they don't take in anymore. They get buried somewhere, and then you try to figure out how much of that is leaked out over the years, and it tells you how old it is. But there are all kinds of errors that they come up with these particular numbers. Here's a rock that's known to be 50 years old from a volcano, and it gets dated at 1,350,000 years old. So there's a lot of fudging goes on with these things. They come up with dates, and they fudge the dates a lot of times to match whatever the fossils in the rock are, and so on. And much fudge room that's involved in these things. Some processes that indicate a young Earth. One of the things that points to a young Earth is our magnetic field is wearing out and getting less at a certain rate every year. The Earth's magnetic field is wearing down so quickly it couldn't be more than 20,000 years old, one scientist was saying. It's getting less at a certain rate. You can go back, the energy is half of what it was 1,465 years ago. If you went back too far back and kept doubling its strength, we get to the point where you couldn't have life existing on Earth. So there's problems that they don't want to point out to children in the textbooks. They want to lay out the material in a political way and in a way that supports their argument. River deltas, the amount of material that the Mississippi River has put out into the Gulf, when you measure it and look at how much flows in there every year, it's thought that it wouldn't be but 4,000 years to get that delta the way it is now, which is certainly in harmony with what the Bible says about how long the Earth has been around and that river's been flowing down. Where's the ocean floor sediment that should be there if the Earth is 3 billion years old? And sediments being washed into the ocean every year. Tremendous amounts of rocks and dirt and sand and all kinds of things, but they can't find the sediment that would represent that period of time. After 3 billion years, there should be 250 times more sediment today than what we see in the ocean. Now, there are certain things that would reduce the amount of sediment. You have this tectonic plate movement that would take away part of it, but there's really not an explanation for what has happened to all of these tons of material that ought to be there. If you have a date back to the time of the flood, there's enough sediment there, but there's not enough sediment for 3 billion years in the ocean. What about the salt that's in the ocean? After 3 billion years, you'd expect there to be 70 times more salt in the ocean than we see in the ocean today. And you have 450 million tons a year that goes into the ocean. About 27% of it gets taken away by, ocean spray being absorbed into the atmosphere, all these different ways, but there's still 62 million tons that's missing. What happened to it? If the Earth is a young Earth and hasn't been here that long, there's no problem. But if it's millions of years old, billions of years old, where's all the salt? We found dinosaur bones recently, as far as geology is concerned, that has soft body parts in it. How can that possibly? It's been there 65 million years and it's still got soft tissue in it. That's a real problem. I mean, you can go online, you can go on YouTube and watch these scientists that discovered this on 60 Minutes, the news program on Sunday nights. It's probably on right now, isn't it? They're talking about it. They show the experiment. They show the blood vessels and different things they found inside these bones. And it doesn't make sense that it could have stayed there for 65 million years, soft tissue, but yet it's there. Now, if they've only been there for 4,000 years, that makes sense. We've got mummies that have been preserved over in Egypt. They've got all those soft body parts, and you can study them and their DNA and all of that. But now they're finding in dinosaur bones those kind of things. There was a large dinosaur mummy that was found in Hell's Creek Formation in 2007. You can see the skin there that got preserved. How's that? Been there a few thousand years. I can see that. 65 billion or million years? How in the world would it still be there? The layers of sediment that were laid down by the flood all over the earth, it was soft, it was pliable, and you could bend it. But if there is several 100 million years between each one of these layers, as we're taught in the geology books and things when we're going to high school and college, those rocks would break. They'd shatter if you tried to bend those layers of rock. We know what rock is and how it would act if you started bending it, but look at these bends that are, you can go down to the Arbuckle Mountains and see the same thing, where they're twisted every different way without being broke, because they were pliable and wet after the flood, when these mountains were pushing up and these things were being formed. Look at this. Here is the Grand Canyon. This is sandstone. You think that might crumble? You started twisting it, a sandstone? You think, well, this is sort of an odd thing just in this one spot. Look how far this sandstone goes. And yet out here it got pushed up and made a big plateau there at the Grand Canyon. Didn't break it. How's that possible if it got laid down over millions of years instead of rapidly, as the Bible would teach? I don't have the figure, I didn't fill in the figures on this one, but the Earth's rotation is something that is slowing down gradually. So many, hundredths of a second. You take that back a certain, these millions of years when you start talking those numbers. You get the Earth spinning so fast that you couldn't have life. It'd just be a flat pancake after a while. The faint sun paradox was one of the key evidences for a young Earth. The sun's power comes from fusion of hydrogen into helium deep in the sun's core. As the hydrogen fuses, it should change the composition of the sun's core, gradually increasing the sun's temperature. So then you start going backwards using their uniformitarian ideas. This means the Earth was colder in the past, even below freezing at 3.5 billion years ago. That's when they say, life was getting started. But the Earth would have been frozen because of this paradox we have with the sun. Isn't that kind of a major hiccup there in your whole theory? that just gets ignored. Let's don't kill the children about that problem. Let's just put the stuff in that promotes our theory about how life began. Let's don't throw in the problem with the sun and fusion going on there. The helium in radioactive rocks. We have helium. It's one of the lightest element, and it should have leaked out of uranium and thorium that's in the rocks of the earth in about 100,000 years. But there's lots of helium still in those rocks. Lots of it. There should be a great amount in the atmosphere, but there's just a little bit of helium in the atmosphere. That's a big problem if you believe in millions of years, billions of years of Earth history. Why hadn't that happened? Why haven't those things leaked out? These are some of the major arguments that creation scientists present. They set forth in debate. We don't see those discussed in our textbooks. Carbon-14 in fossils, in coal, in diamonds even. This is what these scientists tell us about these rates of decay in carbon-14. It says it only lasts about a few 100,000 years. That's why it's found. Why is it found in all of the Earth's diamonds dated at 1 billion years old? These creation scientists, they test diamonds and other stones and say, well, is there any radiocarbon in there? Any carbon-14? And they find it even in a diamond as hard as a diamond is. It should have leaked out long, long time ago. There shouldn't be any carbon-14 in that diamond, but it is. Analyzing fossil wood and coal samples, supposedly spanning 32 to 350 million years, yields ages between 20,000 and 50,000 years when they look at the carbon-14 that's in it. Using carbon-14 dating, it doesn't even come close to what they say it should be. What's their dodge on that? Well, they'll say, well, somehow or another you contaminated the instruments or somehow. There's always some way to try to get out of it. But you take every precaution you possibly can to make the test, and it still comes out saying what they're saying doesn't fit, and it gets shoved to the back. Here's a fossilized sea creature and a piece of wood that are found fossilized together. The sea creature is called an ammonite. Was discovered near Redding, California, accompanied by fossil wood. Both the fossils are claimed by the strata that they're dated in is 112 to 120 million years old, yet the radiocarbon age is only thousands of years old. Again, there are all kinds of contradictions that they don't share with the public. The recession of the moon is another problem. The origin of the moon, I watched a whole video this afternoon on the Answers in Genesis website, which I'd hope you'd go and read in detail, where these scientists have their scientific papers and things on all of these different subjects, way more than I could possibly talk about. They know certainly more about it than I do. The moon is receding from the Earth at about 4 centimeters a year. 100 years ago, it was 12 feet closer to the Earth than it is now. 6,000 years ago, at creation, it was 12 miles closer. No big deal. 12 miles is 250,000 miles out there to the moon. But let's say that these dates that the evolutionists tell us, let's go back 1 billion years. And the closer it gets to the Earth, the more rapidly it would move away from the Earth. So in the past, it would have moved a lot faster. And there's the formula. You want to work on that? Work it out. The moon's going around the Earth, and here's the tide being pulled out, and the Earth is spinning faster than the moon, and it kind of whips the moon around. So it sends it out just a little bit further each year. It's getting moved a little bit further from the Earth. But that same formula, you move it in closer, and it moves faster. So you'd have it within the limit where it would just be crushed to pieces within 1 million years or 1 billion years. There's no way that would work. And yet, most of their theories say that the moon's as old as the Earth, 4.5 billion years old. But that's not possible with this recession that takes place. Population growth. Again, we have man on earth 1 million years plus, according to the evolution teaching and the different textbooks. Creation only, of course, a few thousand years since Noah and those with him came out of the ark. You have a growth rate of 0.5%. That's about 1/4 of what the actual growth rate is, 2%. It'd yield a population of, in 4,000 years, is just what it is now. You take that 2% growth rate, you get our present population in 1,100 years. If you go back and say, okay, we've been here a million years, and you have that smaller growth rate, you still come up with 10 to the 2,100. That's how many zeros you'd have to add to that power. That's more than there are electrons in the universe. Where are all the people? Where are all the people if we've been here a million years? Even if you go back just 50,000 years and you start calculating backwards, there'd be way too many people. You couldn't get them all on the earth. There's no way. So much less a million years, you've got people populating. Comets. They are balls of ice and dirt, we're told, that come in from the far outside the solar system, and then they race through the inner planets and go around the sun and back out. Halley's Comet, it comes in, every 76 years, makes that trip. And every time it goes around the sun, it melts. That's what makes the tail. How many times can you go around the sun until you finally don't have a comet anymore? And yet they're supposed to have been here since the beginning of creation. You can see there's time limits and problems with all of these things. They have to come out with this Oort cloud that makes comets, new ones, but we've never seen an Oort cloud. I don't know, Morgan, you may have came from Oort, right, or something. I don't know, but it's an imaginary place. It doesn't really exist. Don't have any evidence of it. But that's the explanation. It's making new comets. There are different interpretations of creation that I'm going to stop there. I don't think I want to go into those. We'll look at maybe these things in some other lessons in the future. Well, I hope that these will at least whet your appetite to do some more studying. There are all kinds of good books, whether it's on the, bookstores that are run by brethren, or you go online and go to Answers in Genesis, or the Creation Research Society, which is made up of all people with advanced degrees in different fields of science that believe in the Bible and believe in creation. There are organizations in every state of the union and in many countries around the world made up of scientists with advanced degrees in all these different fields. And they've written books and papers. They set forth the evidence. And I encourage you to study those things and get some of those materials, share them with your children, grandchildren, so that they have an answer when they go off to school or go off to college. This time we want to extend the Lord's invitation to those that are present this evening. We believe that God created the world by His Word, and we trust the evidence of God, and we trust the confidence of His reputation for truth and always being accurate for creation. He's also given us tremendous evidence about His Son, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, in prophecy, by miracle, by wisdom, by moral excellence, by the resurrection, by the ascension, by the sending of the Holy Spirit with gifts, by the writings of all the books of our Bible and the wisdom there. All of it shows Jesus is the Son of God. If you believe that, we want to encourage you to obey the gospel tonight by repenting and confessing and being baptized. As a child of God, you need the prayers of the church. They're also extended to you. Together we stand and sing.